The quiet suburb of Pine Grove wasn't used to making headlines, but that would soon change. Mrs. Thompson, a middle-aged real estate agent with perfectly styled blonde hair and an ever-present scowl, had earned quite a reputation in the community. While she presented herself as a pillar of society at her exclusive country club, locals had a different name for her. They called her Country Club Karen, though never to her face. On a sunny Tuesday morning, like any other day, she was cruising down Oak Street in her white Range Rover, one hand clutching her designer coffee cup while the other furiously typed away at her phone. She was in the middle of posting another angry complaint on the neighborhood app about the new family-owned restaurant that had opened nearby, their fourth complaint this month about a minority-owned business. The flash of red and blue lights in her mirror made her jump, causing her to spill her $7 coffee all over her cream-colored designer pants. A police cruiser had pulled up behind her, lights flashing. Through her rearview mirror, she could see a black police officer stepping out of the patrol car. The officer was well known in the community, a respected 12-year veteran of the force who spent his free time coaching the local youth basketball team and organizing community events. As she watched the officer approach through her side mirror, Mrs. Thompson's perfectly manicured fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. This wasn't her first run-in with law enforcement. She had a history of filing complaints against any officer who dared to give her a ticket, especially if they weren't white. The neighborhood Facebook group was full of her lengthy rants about unfair treatment whenever things didn't go her way. The officer approached her window with a professional demeanor, his body camera glinting in the morning sun. "Good morning, ma'am. I noticed you were texting while driving, which is a violation of state law." His voice was calm and courteous. He'd done this thousands of times before. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't having it. Her face flushed red as she clutched her designer handbag closer. "Do you know who I am?" she snapped, her voice rising with each word. "I'm on the board of the Pine Grove Country Club. I personally know the police chief." The officer remained professional, explaining the dangers of distracted driving and requesting her license and registration. But with each passing moment, Mrs. Thompson's behavior became more erratic. Other drivers slowed down to watch the scene unfold, some even pulling out their phones to record what was happening. "I don't have to show you anything," she declared, her voice shaking with anger. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the growing rage on her face. The officer had dealt with difficult traffic stops before, but something about this woman's demeanor set off warning bells in his mind. He took a small step back from the vehicle, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Ma'am, I need to see your license and registration. This is a routine traffic stop, and I'm just doing my job." He couldn't have known that his next words would trigger what was about to become one of the most shocking incidents in Pine Grove's history. Little did anyone realize that this routine traffic stop was about to explode into a chain of events that would not only rock their peaceful community, but also make national headlines. The security cameras from the nearby coffee shop were quietly recording everything, soon to become crucial evidence in what would turn into a case that would change lives forever. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and nearby pedestrians could sense that something was very wrong. They just didn't know they were about to witness an act that would divide their community and spark a conversation that was long overdue. What happened next would be replayed thousands of times on news channels across the country. The officer stood patiently by the Range Rover's window, his hand resting calmly on his notepad. "Ma'am, one last time. I need to see your license and registration," he said, his voice steady despite the growing hostility. Mrs. Thompson's perfectly manicured fingers were shaking as she gripped her steering wheel even tighter. Her face had turned an alarming shade of red, and sweat was starting to smear her expensive makeup. "I don't answer to you," she spat out, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Do you even know who my husband is?" The growing crowd of onlookers outside the nearby coffee shop watched in disbelief as she continued her tirade. A teenager working at the drive-through window had his phone out, recording everything. The officer's body camera captured every word, every gesture, as the situation spiraled out of control. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," the officer instructed firmly but professionally. He'd handled hundreds of traffic stops before, but something in his gut told him this one was different. The way she kept glancing at her gear shift, the way her whole body seemed to vibrate with anger. These were warning signs he'd learned to recognize over his years on the force. Mrs. Thompson's response was chilling. "I don't take orders from people like you," she snarled, emphasizing the last word in a way that made several bystanders gasp. Her hand moved to her gear shift, and the engine revved loudly. The officer recognized the danger signs immediately. He took 2 quick steps back, his hand raised. "Ma'am, turn off your vehicle now," he commanded, but it was too late. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the horrified witnesses. The Range Rover's engine roared to life. The officer, realizing what was about to happen, tried to dive out of the way. But Mrs. Thompson had turned her steering wheel sharply, deliberately aiming for him. The sickening thud of impact echoed through the street. The officer was thrown onto the hood of his patrol car, his body crumpling against the windshield. The Range Rover's tires squealed against the pavement as Mrs. Thompson floored the accelerator, leaving behind the chaos she just created. People rushed forward to help the fallen officer. A nurse who'd been getting her morning coffee sprinted over, immediately checking his vital signs. "Call 911," she shouted, though someone already had their phone out. The officer lay motionless, his uniform dusty and torn, his breathing shallow but steady. The teenager from the coffee shop ran out with their phone footage, hands shaking. "I got it all," they said, their voice trembling. "I got her license plate, too." Other witnesses were already giving statements to the 911 dispatcher, describing the white Range Rover and its driver in detail. Within minutes, the quiet morning air was filled with sirens as police cars and an ambulance raced to the scene. Fellow officers arrived to find their colleague conscious but badly injured, surrounded by concerned citizens who'd witnessed the entire incident. The coffee shop manager was already downloading security camera footage to hand over to investigators. As paramedics carefully loaded the injured officer into the ambulance, a detective interviewed witnesses. Each person's account painted the same disturbing picture. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act born of hatred and rage, captured in high definition by multiple cameras and dozens of witnesses. The hunt for the white Range Rover was already beginning. Police dispatchers broadcast the vehicle description and plate number to every officer in the county. But Mrs. Thompson had vanished into the morning traffic, leaving behind a community in shock and an injured officer fighting for recovery. Little did she know, her desperate attempt to escape was only the beginning of a story that would change not just her life, but an entire community forever. Her face would soon be plastered across every news channel and social media platform in the country, as the consequences of her actions began to unfold. The emergency room at Pine Grove General Hospital buzzed with activity as doctors worked on the injured officer. His fellow officers gathered in the waiting room, their faces grim and worried. The police chief paced back and forth, his phone constantly ringing with updates about the investigation and calls from news outlets trying to get the story. "He's got a broken leg, 3 cracked ribs, and a serious concussion," the doctor explained to the anxious group. "But he's stable. He's tough. He'll pull through." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. The officer's wife sat quietly in the corner, holding their daughter's hand, both still in shock from the morning's events. Outside the hospital, the community was already rallying. The story had spread like wildfire through social media and local news. The coffee shop where it happened had put up a donation box for the officer's family, and within hours, it was overflowing with cash and gift cards. People kept stopping by to drop off home-cooked meals at the police station. But it wasn't just about support. People were angry. Really angry. Security camera footage from the coffee shop, had already made its way to local news stations. The video clearly showed Mrs. Thompson's Range Rover deliberately swerving to hit the officer. There was no way she could claim it was an accident. "I've known him for years," said the owner of the local hardware store, speaking to a TV reporter. "He helped my kids' basketball team raise money for new uniforms last summer." Who does something like this to a person who's just doing their job? The reporter nodded, jotting down notes as more community members came forward with stories about the injured officer's kindness and dedication to the community. Meanwhile, at the police station, investigators were piecing together a disturbing pattern. They pulled up Mrs. Thompson's social media accounts and found a history of hateful posts and complaints. The neighborhood app was full of her rants about minority-owned businesses. She'd filed numerous complaints against officers of color who'd given her tickets in the past. "Look at this," one detective said, pointing at his computer screen. 3 months ago, she tried to get a black family's kids arrested for selling lemonade in their own front yard. Called the police 4 times in one day about it. His partner shook his head in disgust as they added it to their growing file. The injured officer's body camera footage was even more damning. The tech team had retrieved it from his equipment, and it showed everything: her hostile attitude, her racist comments, and the moment she deliberately turned her wheel to hit him. The footage was crystal clear, leaving no room for doubt about her intentions. Back at the hospital, something unexpected was happening. People from all over town were showing up with cards, flowers, and well wishes. The nurse at the front desk had to start a sign-up sheet to organize all the visitors wanting to check on the officer's condition. A young girl, maybe 12 years old, walked up to the officer's wife with a handmade card. "He taught me how to dribble at basketball camp last summer," she said shyly. "I hope he gets better soon." The officer's wife hugged her, tears in her eyes. This was the real face of their community, not the hatred they'd seen that morning. Local businesses started putting up signs in their windows: "Get well soon," and "We stand together against hate." The high school students organized a candlelight vigil for that evening. Even people from neighboring towns were calling the police station, asking how they could help. As day turned to evening, the injured officer was stable enough to speak with investigators. Despite everything that had happened, his first words weren't about himself. He asked if anyone else had been hurt during the incident. That was just the kind of person he was, always thinking of others first. But while the community came together in support, Mrs. Thompson was still out there somewhere. Her Range Rover had been spotted heading north on the highway, and every police department in the state was now on high alert. The clock was ticking, and she was about to learn that running from your actions only makes the consequences worse. The investigation room at Pine Grove Police Department was buzzing with activity. Detectives had been working nonstop for 24 hours since the incident, their desks covered with coffee cups and case files. The lead detective pinned another photo to the investigation board. This time, a traffic camera shot of Mrs. Thompson's Range Rover heading toward the state line. "We've got something interesting," called out a young detective, waving a stack of papers. "Look at her credit card records." The team gathered around his computer screen. Mrs. Thompson had stopped at a gas station 50 miles north, then made a purchase at a convenience store another 30 miles up the highway. She was leaving a trail, and she didn't even realize it. But what really caught their attention was her phone activity. Even while on the run, she couldn't stay off social media. She'd been frantically messaging right-wing news outlets, trying to tell their side of the story. "They're all turning her down," the tech analyst explained, scrolling through intercepted emails. "Even they won't touch this case after seeing the video evidence." Meanwhile, more witnesses from the coffee shop incident were coming forward. A food delivery driver showed up at the station with dashcam footage that captured the whole thing from a different angle. "I couldn't sleep knowing I had this and hadn't turned it in," he said, handing over the memory card. The police chief called a press conference in front of the station. News vans lined the street as he stepped up to the microphones. "We're dealing with this case as what it is, a hate crime and attempted murder of a police officer, he announced firmly. We have clear evidence this was a deliberate act motivated by racial hatred. Local TV stations kept playing the security camera footage on repeat. Each time it aired, more tips came flooding in. A truck driver called to report seeing the Range Rover at a rest stop. A motel owner recognized Mrs. Thompson from when she tried to check in, but turned away when asked for ID. Back at the hospital, the injured officer was making progress. Physical therapists had him sitting up in bed, though moving was still painful. Cards and letters poured in from across the country as his story made national news. One envelope contained drawings from a first-grade class he'd visited during career day last month. "Look at this," his wife said, opening another letter. Inside was a check for $5,000 from a stranger in another state. "Please use this for medical expenses," the note read. "Your husband represents the kind of police officer we need more of in this world." The officer insisted the money be donated to the youth center where he volunteered instead. The investigation took an interesting turn when Mrs. Thompson's own friends started coming forward. "She's been getting worse over the past year," one former friend told detectives. "She started following these extreme online groups, sharing their posts. We tried to talk to her about it, but she just cut us off." Her social media history painted a disturbing picture. The tech team uncovered hundreds of deleted posts showing a pattern of escalating hatred. They found videos of her harassing minority shopkeepers, confronting people speaking different languages in public, and making threats at community meetings. "She's running out of options," the lead detective told his team during their evening briefing. "Her credit cards are being tracked, her face is all over the news, and she's almost out of gas money." They'd set up a special hotline for tips, and it hadn't stopped ringing since going live. The local newspaper ran a feature about the injured officer's community work, his youth mentoring program, the food drives he organized, the time he used his own money to buy supplies for a struggling family. People who'd never met him were touched by the stories of his kindness. As night fell, Mrs. Thompson's Range Rover was spotted again, this time at a small motel just shy of the state border. She'd made a crucial mistake, using her real name to check in. The net was closing in, and she had no idea that karma was about to catch up with her in a way she never expected. The cheap motel room felt like a prison to Mrs. Thompson. Gone were her designer clothes and perfectly styled hair. Now she wore a baseball cap pulled low over her face and clothes bought from a discount store. Her Range Rover sat hidden behind the motel, covered with a tarp she'd bought at a hardware store. She paced the small room, checking her phone obsessively. Her bank accounts were getting low. She'd had to withdraw cash quickly before they could be frozen, and expensive habits die hard. The room's TV droned in the background, showing her own face on every news channel. She quickly changed to a shopping network instead. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. Her husband hadn't answered any of her calls. Her country club friends were publicly distancing themselves from her. Even her favorite conservative blog had posted an article condemning her actions. She was truly alone, and it was all catching up to her. "They're making me look like a monster," she muttered to herself, typing another angry email to a news station. But even as she wrote it, she knew they wouldn't respond. The surveillance videos were too clear, the evidence too strong. Her own words, captured on the officer's body camera, left no room for interpretation. She tried scrolling through social media on her burner phone, but that only made things worse. Her face was everywhere. People were sharing old videos of her harassing store owners and yelling at servers. Former neighbors were posting stories about her past behavior. Someone had even dug up complaints she'd filed against minority homeowners in her real estate days. The motel manager walked past her room for the third time that hour, peering suspiciously at her door. Mrs. Thompson's hands shook as she packed her bag again. She'd have to move soon. She couldn't risk staying in one place too long. But her options were running out, just like her money. She tried reaching out to some extreme online groups she followed, hoping they'd help her. But even they wouldn't touch her case. Too much heat, one had replied before blocking her. Another called her radioactive and suggested she turn herself in. Looking in the bathroom mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her expensive highlights were growing out, showing gray roots. Her carefully maintained manicure was chipped. She'd lost her entire life in just a few days, and for what? Because she couldn't control her anger during a simple traffic stop. The walls felt like they were closing in. She jumped at every siren in the distance, every car door that slammed in the parking lot. The local news was reporting that tips were flooding in about her location. Someone at a gas station had recognized her. A diner waitress thought she'd served her breakfast. She pulled out her laptop one last time, hoping to transfer more money from her savings account. But the screen showed what she'd been dreading. Her accounts had been frozen. The credit cards were next. Soon she'd be down to just the cash in her purse. Outside her room, life went on. Families checked in for their vacations. Truckers stopped for the night. The ice machine hummed. But for Mrs. Thompson, each normal sound felt like an accusation. Each passing shadow could be the police. Each glance from another guest could be recognition. She thought about the officer she'd hit. The news said he was recovering, already talking about returning to his community work. People were calling him a hero, sharing stories about his kindness. Meanwhile, she was hiding in a shabby motel room, eating vending machine snacks and jumping at shadows. The sun was setting outside her window when she heard it, the distinct sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the parking lot at once. Her heart stopped when she peeked through the curtains. Police cars were quietly rolling in, lights off, surrounding the building. The motel manager stood in the parking lot, pointing directly at her room. In that moment, Mrs. Thompson realized something that would haunt her forever. There's no running from karma when your actions are driven by hate. And her karma had finally caught up with her. This is the police. Come out with your hands up. The command echoed through the motel's thin walls. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen in her room, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The cheap curtains glowed blue and red from the police lights now flashing outside. She had two choices: give up peacefully or make things worse. For a moment, she considered trying to run through the bathroom window, but one look outside showed officers positioned everywhere. Her Range Rover was blocked in. There was nowhere left to go. Final warning. The voice boomed through a megaphone. Come out now. Other motel guests were peeking out of their rooms, phones raised to record everything. The manager had opened all the surrounding rooms, letting police position themselves safely. Mrs. Thompson's hands shook as she reached for the door handle. The same hands that had gripped the steering wheel just days ago, making that terrible choice that had destroyed her life. As she opened the door, the bright spotlights nearly blinded her. Hands where we can see them. She squinted into the light, raising her trembling hands. At least 6 officers had their weapons drawn, standard procedure for someone who'd already tried to kill a cop. But what struck her most was the silence. No one was yelling anymore. They didn't need to. The lead detective stepped forward with handcuffs. "You're under arrest," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the now quiet parking lot. As she listed the charges: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, hate crime enhancements. Mrs. Thompson finally broke down. "Do you know who I am?" She tried one last time, her voice cracking. The detective didn't even pause as she secured the handcuffs. "Yes, ma'am, we know exactly who you are. And so does everyone else now." The words hit harder than any shout could have. Phones recorded as officers led her to the waiting police car. Her designer baseball cap fell off, revealing her graying roots and unwashed hair. She looked nothing like the polished country club member from just days ago. Reality had caught up, and it wasn't pretty. Back at the station, the booking process was mechanical and impersonal. Fingerprints. Mugshot. The flash of the camera caught her smeared makeup and tears. The same officer taking her picture had attended community events she'd organized. Now he wouldn't meet her eyes. In the interview room, she tried to explain herself to the detectives, but every excuse fell flat against the evidence. The officer's body camera footage, the coffee shop security video, the witnesses, her own social media history, the paper trail of complaints she'd filed against minorities. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," the lead detective said, laying out photos from the crime scene. "The officer you hit, he's going to recover. He's already talking about getting back to his community work. Meanwhile, you're facing 25 to life." More revelations poured in. Her real estate license was already suspended. The country club had revoked her membership. Her husband's law firm had released a statement distancing themselves from her actions. Former clients were coming forward with stories of discrimination. The holding cell felt even smaller than the motel room. As she sat on a hard bench, she could hear officers in the hallway discussing the case. They weren't angry. Their voices were filled with something worse: pity. She'd become a cautionary tale, an example of how hatred consumes the hater first. Outside the station, reporters gathered for the official announcement of her capture. The police chief kept it professional and brief. But it was the statement from the injured officer's wife that caught everyone's attention. "We pray she finds peace and learns from this. Hate hurts everyone it touches." As night fell over the station, Mrs. Thompson realized something profound. All her life, she'd looked down on others, thinking she was untouchable. Now, sitting in a cold cell, she understood. Karma doesn't care about your social status or bank account. It just waits patiently until a bill comes due. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and spectators as Mrs. Thompson made her first court appearance. She wore an orange jumpsuit instead of her usual designer clothes, her hands cuffed in front of her. Her lawyer walked beside her, a court-appointed defender since her husband's fancy law firm had refused to represent her. Inside the courtroom, she barely recognized herself on the evidence screens. The security footage played in slow motion. Her Range Rover deliberately swerving, the officer flying over the hood. She couldn't look at it. But the worst was yet to come. The prosecution calls its first witness, the district attorney announced. The injured officer wheeled himself to the witness stand, his legs still in a cast. The courtroom fell silent. He spoke clearly about that morning, describing everything professionally, without anger or hatred. That made it even more powerful. "All I was thinking about," he testified, "was getting home to my family that night. It was supposed to be just another traffic stop." His words hung in the air. In the gallery, his wife held their daughter's hand tightly. The jury members watched intently, some taking notes. More witnesses followed. The coffee shop workers, the delivery driver with the dash cam, the teenager who'd recorded everything on their phone. Each person's testimony added another piece to the puzzle. Mrs. Thompson sank lower in her chair as the evidence mounted. The district attorney presented her social media history, posts filled with hate, videos of her harassing people, complaints she'd filed against minority business owners. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Her lawyer could only sit there, knowing any defense would fall flat against such overwhelming evidence. Then came the experts. A forensic analyst showed how the Range Rover's steering and acceleration proved that hit was intentional. A social media expert traced her growing involvement with hate groups online. A psychologist explained how unchecked bias can escalate into violent actions. During a break, Mrs. Thompson overheard two reporters talking outside the bathroom. Her real estate office found dozens of cases where she steered minority buyers away from white neighborhoods, one said. They're facing a huge investigation now. Her past was unraveling, revealing years of hidden prejudice. The defense tried to paint her as stressed, having a bad day, but the prosecution had an answer for everything. They showed clips of her previous encounters with police, always hostile, always targeting officers of color. The jury's expressions grew more serious with each piece of evidence. The defendant didn't just attack an officer, the district attorney said in closing arguments. She attacked everything our community stands for. This wasn't a mistake or an accident. This was hate in action, and it has no place in our society. Mrs. Thompson's lawyer barely put up a defense. What could he say? The videos showed everything. The evidence was overwhelming. Even character witnesses had refused to testify on her behalf. Former friends didn't want to be associated with her actions. The jury took just 3 hours to reach a verdict. The courtroom was packed as they filed back in. Mrs. Thompson stood, trembling, as the foreman read the decision. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, hit and run, and hate crime enhancements. Before sentencing, the judge announced, "I want to address something." He looked directly at Mrs. Thompson. "Your actions showed us the worst of humanity. But the community's response, the way they rallied around the injured officer, the way they stood up against hate, that showed us the best." Outside, reporters rushed to get reactions. The injured officer's wife spoke briefly. "We're grateful for justice, but we take no joy in this. Hate destroys everything it touches, the hated and the hater both." Her words would be quoted in newspapers across the country. Mrs. Thompson was led away to await sentencing. As the courthouse emptied, one thing was clear: this case would be remembered not just for the crime, but as a moment when a community stood together and said no to hate. Sentencing day arrived with a heavy atmosphere in the courthouse. Mrs. Thompson sat at the defendant's table, looking years older than she had just months ago. The prison jumpsuit hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight during her time in custody, and her once perfect hair had turned completely gray. Before announcing the sentence, the judge allowed victim impact statements. The injured officer wheeled himself to the front, now able to move without assistance, but still recovering. His voice remained steady as he addressed the court. "I don't speak today seeking revenge," he began. "I speak for every officer who's faced hatred while just doing their job. For every person who's been judged by their skin color instead of their character. My injury will heal, that our community needs to heal too." His teenage daughter spoke next, her voice shaking slightly. "My dad missed my basketball championship because he was in the hospital. But he still made me go play, saying we can't let hate stop us from living our lives. That's the kind of person he is, the kind of person she tried to kill." The coffee shop owner described how his business had become a symbol of community unity. "People come in now and put money in our Stop Hate donation jar. They say they want to be part of the solution. Something good is coming from something terrible." Mrs. Thompson had the right to speak before sentencing. Her lawyer advised against it, but she insisted. Standing on shaky legs, she faced the courtroom. But the practiced arrogance was gone. For the first time, she looked truly broken. "I used to think I was better than everyone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had money, status, the right friends. But sitting in jail, I realized I was the poorest person in town. Poor in spirit, poor in humanity. Everything I looked down on others for, I was worse." The judge listened carefully, his expression neutral. When she finished, he took a long moment before speaking. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "In my 30 years on the bench," he began, "I've seen many cases of violence. But what makes this one different is the deliberate nature of your actions. This wasn't a moan of passion or a mistake. This was the inevitable result of years of cultivated hatred." He shuffled through his papers, but he wasn't really reading them. Everyone knew he'd spent hours preparing this statement. "Your actions didn't just harm one officer. They ripped at the fabric of our community. They forced us to confront the reality that hate still lives among us, wearing designer clothes and sitting on charity boards." The sentence came down: 25 years. No possibility of early release. Mrs. Thompson swayed slightly but remained standing. Behind her, someone in the gallery whispered, "Good." Several others nodded in agreement. As officers led her away, reporters rushed to get comments from everyone involved. The district attorney spoke about sending a message that hate crimes would be punished severely. The police chief discussed new training programs being implemented. But it was the injured officer's wife who summed it up best. 25 years won't erase hate, she told the reporters. That takes education, understanding, and love. We're working on that part now, starting programs in schools, teaching kids that difference isn't dangerous. The story made national headlines. Country Club Karen gets 25 years. But in Pine Grove, it was more than just a sensational news story. It was a wake-up call. The country club started diversity initiatives. Real estate agencies implemented anti-discrimination training. Schools added programs about recognizing and responding to hate. As Mrs. Thompson was processed into the state prison system, the officer she tried to kill was back at work, walking with a slight limp but determined as ever. He turned down offers to retire, saying, "The best answer to hate is to keep serving, keep showing love to everyone in our community." The case would be taught in law schools, discussed in police academies, and referenced in civil rights classes. But in Pine Grove, people remembered it differently, as the moment their community chose unity over division, love over hate, and justice over vengeance. 1 year later, Pine Grove had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The spot where the incident happened now featured a small garden, created by local high school students. A simple plaque read, "Hate divides, love unites." The coffee shop had become a popular meeting place for community groups working on social justice issues. The injured officer had not only returned to full duty, but had been promoted to lieutenant. He now headed the department's new community relations division, using his experience to train other officers about handling bias-motivated incidents. His story was featured in police training videos nationwide. "What happened that day could have made me bitter," he told a group of police academy recruits. "Instead, it showed me how many good people are ready to stand up against hate." The recruits listened intently. Many had chosen law enforcement careers after hearing his story. His youth basketball program had grown too. What started with one team now included kids from every neighborhood in town. Parents who'd never spoken to each other before now sat together at games, cheering for all the children. Real friendships were forming across old social boundaries. The country club where Mrs. Thompson had once reigned supreme had undergone its own transformation. New leadership implemented diversity initiatives and community outreach programs. They offered scholarships to minority youth and hosted cultural awareness events. The change wasn't always smooth, but it was real. Mrs. Thompson's old real estate office had been completely restructured. The investigation into her past practices led to new anti-discrimination policies across the industry. Home buyers of all backgrounds now reported feeling welcome in every neighborhood. The firm even hired fair housing advocates to train their agents. In the state prison, Mrs. Thompson spent her days in the library, reading books about civil rights history. Her letters to the parole board showed someone struggling to understand how she'd let hate consume her life. "I lost everything," she wrote, "but maybe someone can learn from my mistakes." The local elementary school started a new tradition. Every month, they invited people from different backgrounds to share their stories with students. "We're teaching kids that different doesn't mean dangerous," the principal explained. "They're learning that every person has value." The injured officer's wife had started a support group for families affected by hate crimes. "Healing happens in community," she often said. The group attracted people from surrounding towns, all sharing stories and finding strength together. Even the mayor attended meetings sometimes. Local businesses put up signs reading, "Hate has no home here," in multiple languages. But more importantly, they backed up those words with actions. Hiring diverse staff, supporting minority-owned suppliers, creating welcoming spaces for everyone. The teenager who recorded the original incident had turned that experience into positive action. They started a social media campaign called Capture Kindness, encouraging people to record and share moments of unity and understanding in their community. It went viral, spreading to other cities. At the police station, the wall now displayed photos of officers participating in community events, reading to kids, playing basketball with teens, sharing meals with elderly residents. "We're not just enforcing laws," the chief explained. "We're building bridges." The courthouse where Mrs. Thompson was sentenced began hosting monthly community dialogues. Judges, lawyers, and citizens discussed how to make the justice system fairer for everyone. People who'd never felt heard before were finally getting a chance to speak. One day, a reporter asked the injured officer if he had any message for Mrs. Thompson. His response made headlines. "I forgive her, not because she deserves it, but because hate is too heavy a burden to carry. My community showed me that love is stronger than any hate." As Pine Grove moved forward, the incident remained a powerful reminder. Not just of how quickly hate can destroy lives, but of how communities can choose a different path. The garden where it all happened kept blooming, season after season, just like the hope it represented. The story became more than just a viral video or shocking headline. It became a lesson about choices. Choosing love over hate, understanding over ignorance, unity over division. In the end, Pine Grove showed that while one person's hate can cause great harm, a community's love can heal even deeper wounds.